Thank you, sir. Thank you all for coming. Dare I ask how many pastors are in the room? One? Well, I hope those of you who are not pastors will take this message back to your churches, because what I'm going to talk about is one of the most important things, one of the most important stories in American history, and that's about the founding of the nation. One of the points I'll make tonight throughout this message is that pastors were the founding fathers. They were not just incidental to the American Revolution. They were at the forefront of it. They were at the thick of it. Effectively, what pastors did is they forged the political worldview that made this nation. They forged in their preaching, they forged the freest, most prosperous, most beneficent, most prolific missionary sending nation in human history. That's what pastors did. The founding fathers were great men. No, there's no question about that. The men that sat in the congressional meetings and wrote our founding charters, but they were not the founding fathers. They learned everything they learned from the pulpits of America. So I'll go through some of the history of that now. Jonathan Mayhew, he was 29 years old. That's pretty young. He was considered the most talented preacher in New England. He pastored the Old West Church in Boston. He preached a sermon in 1715 concerning a discourse concerning unlimited submission and non-resistance to the higher powers. Historians call that sermon the morning gun of the Revolution. 15 years before the Revolution started, there was a sermon that he preached. It was given out, it was printed, it was given out throughout the colonies. It came to be known as the morning gun of the Revolution. Robert Treat Paine called Mayhew the father of civil and religious liberty in America. This is what he said in that sermon. Resistance to arbitrary power, he said, is making use of the means and the only means which God has put into the power of the people for mutual and self-defense. And it would be highly criminal in them not to make use of this means. It would be stupid tameness and unaccountable folly for whole nations to suffer one unreasonable, ambitious, and cruel man, he was speaking about the king. And in such a case, it would be more rational to suppose that those who do not resist tyranny would receive to themselves damnation. That's how strongly clergy of that era felt about tyranny and not resisting it. It's actually evil to tolerate tyranny, at least according to the men that made America. He said this also in that sermon: a people oppressed in great degree by their sovereign have a dragon for their protector and guardian. They would have no reason to mourn if some Hercules should appear to dispatch him. For a nation to thus arise unanimously and resist their prince, even to his dethronement, is not criminal, but a reasonable way of vindicating their liberties and just rights. That was one sermon. That was one of the sermons that shaped the thinking of Americans. How many of you know where the revolution began, the American Revolution? Lexington, 1775, April 19, 1775. The shot heard around the world. Who was the pastor in Lexington? Jonas Clark. He was the pastor of the Church of Christ in Lexington. He was considered the most powerful politician in Lexington and Concord. He was a pastor. He authored all the crucial state papers written to represent Lexington. His home was a frequent meeting place for men like John Adams and John Hancock and Sam Adams, when safety could not be assured in Boston. He was entertaining Sam Adams and John Hancock on the night that Paul Revere came to Lexington to notify them that the British were coming by foot. A pastor had actually helped John Parker train the militia in Lexington. This is what one historian wrote about that pastor. He said he said Lexington's congregational minister, Jonas Clark, was more dangerous than all the military stores in Concord or in the colony. And it so infected the whole district with his calm and deep indignation that when regulars, that's British regulars, came marching up the old turnpike in the gray dawn of April 19, 1775, they found all the farmers converted to a doctrine of liberty that armed and provisioned the young nation for 7 years of war. He was dangerous. I would ask pastors today, are you dangerous to tyranny? Does your preaching threaten tyranny? I believe God expects it to. Paul Revere arrived on the doorstep of Clark's parsonage around midnight. He found the family at rest. He conveyed the message that British troops are coming by foot, and they have orders to destroy the town's weapon stores and arrest the 2 men that were staying with Clark that night. And Hancock or Sam Adams turned to the pastor and said, "Sir, will your people fight?" And the pastor responded, "I have prepared them for this very hour." Now that's a pastor, folks. Now the next day, when the shooting on Lexington Green ended, Clark had lost 7 men from his church. They were laying there dead on Lexington Green. He had to say preach the funeral sermon that week with caskets piled 8 high in his church. Today, we worry we're going to lose a member if we speak politically. Clark lost 8 men from his church in one morning. He had to preach their funeral sermons. He didn't go, maybe I've been too strong here. Maybe I need to tone it down a little bit. No, a year later, effectively, what he preached on the anniversary was, "From this day shall be dated the liberty of the world." And it was dated from that point. The immediate effect of Lexington and Concord. Clark wasn't alone. Pastors throughout the region rallied the men of their flocks and marched toward the fighting to defend their fellow Americans. From towns and villages across New England, Minutemen, many led by their pastors, confronted the British at Concord. British were surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned. During their British retreat to Boston, militia totaling 20,000, including pastors, engaged the British along the road leading back to Boston, called Battle Road, firing from the cover of rock walls, fences, and trees, inflicting more than 320 casualties on the British. The Patriots had about 92 when that was all done. Jonathan French from Andover, Massachusetts, when he heard about a battle at Bunker Hill, marched to war carrying both his medical case and his musket. He served as a drummer during the war and fought at Castle William in Boston Harbor. David Avery of Gageboro, Vermont, served as a chaplain and captain of the men from his church. He marched to Boston and was present for duty during the battle. Was a great encouragement to the troops as he was seen conspicuously praying for victory. Spent the weary winter of 77 to 78 with General Washington and his soldiers. David Grosvenor. At the Lexington alarm, Captain Grosvenor, Reverend Captain Grosvenor, from Pomfret, Connecticut, marched in the ranks to Cambridge. When the militia was called upon to oppose the British troops, the young and patriotic minister shouldered his own musket and marched with 2 companies part of the way on their hurried march to Boston. Pastor Samuel Ells of Bradford, Connecticut, heard that George Washington and his troops were in dire need of assistance. He read the notice from his pulpit, and then he and his men formed a company of which he was the captain. Pastor Samuel McClintock of Greenland, New Hampshire, his deep commitment and his family to liberty was evidenced in the death of 3 of his 4 sons during the Revolution. John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. Some of you may have heard of him. He pastored in Virginia, near where I live. And Muhlenberg was an amazing man. He was part of the Virginia Convention, the Virginia Congressional Convention. He was present in the room when Patrick Henry delivered his liberty or death speech. And when Henry was finished and saying, "Give me liberty and give me death," he motioned that all Virginia counties be put into a state of defense. What that insinuated was that militia had to be raised in every one of those counties. And it was Pastor Muhlenberg who raised his hand to second Henry's motion. Obviously, he didn't get the memo about separation of church and state. He was the son, John Peter was the son of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, the founder of the Lutheran Church in America. He pastored German-speaking Lutheran and English-speaking Church of England congregations in the northern Shenandoah Valley. He was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. He, as I said, he was present for Henry's Liberty or Death speech at Christ Church in Richmond. And he was asked by Washington when he was there to accept a commission in the Continental Army as a colonel. He didn't go, I can't do that, I'm a pastor. He accepted the commission, rode back to Woodstock several days later, entered the pulpit for the last time. And if you're familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verses 1 through 8, it begins with, to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted, and so on and so forth. He got to the 8th verse where it says there's a time for war and a time for peace. And in a voice that thundered, the account says. He needed to be heard by the people that were standing in the graveyard outside the church to hear him. The colonies were in such an uproar over what had just happened in Lexington, they considered it a brutal act of murder what the British had done. So people came from far and wide to hear him. He shouted in a voice that thundered, in the language of Holy Writ, there's a time for all things. A time to pray and a time to fight. The time to fight has come. That's pretty dramatic, but then he threw off his robe in the pulpit. He was already dressed in full uniform as a colonel. And he came down from the pulpit, said the benediction, and then he ordered drums. He told the praise team to start beating drums at the rear of the church, beating cadence for recruits. And he ended up recruiting 300 men from the front, that was then the frontier of America, to form what was known as the 8th Virginia Regiment. He marched off to war with 300 men from the Shenandoah, from the northern Shenandoah region, and he fought very capably under Washington. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. His brother Friedrich, who was a pastor in New York, because there was a lot of pastors in the Muhlenberg family, his brother Friedrich, who was a pastor, wrote to him and said, Peter, you have no business leaving the pulpit for the battlefield. You're called to be a minister. Why are you leaving the service of God to wait on tables, so to speak? They had a debate in letters that came to be known as the Battle of the Quills. Toward the end of the war, when Friedrich's church in New York was burned down, he had come around to Peter's way of thinking, got interested in government and politics, and decided that he would run for Congress. He was elected to the first Congress, and he actually became the first Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, a clergyman. And incidentally, his brother Peter, who also ran for the first Congress, became a congressman. So we had two brothers, two clergymen serving in the first Congress. Back to that memo about separation of church and state. It didn't exist. It was nowhere in the Founding Fathers' thinking. At the end of the Revolution, Peter, as he was nicknamed, was breveted to Major General, and he had won over his brother Friedrich in the Battle of the Quills. When he was implored by his flock, come back and be our, you can imagine he was a hero, and his flock's begging him, come back and be our pastor. How would you like to have a U.S. general who had just won the American Revolution to be your pastor? Everybody wanted him to come back and be their pastor. So Muhlenberg responds, I can no longer build the house of God because I'm a bloody man. Kind of like David said to Solomon. And he ran for Congress, as I said, and his brother Friedrich was also elected. These and many, many, many other numerous examples attest to the preeminence of the clergy in what one historian referred to as the monumental task of independence. Led the British to credit the black-robed American clergy with the rebellion. That's why the American clergy came to be referred to by the British as the Black Regiment, because they wore full-length black gowns when they preached. It was a derisive insult. It was an insult against how they dressed when they preached. The European view. Religion gave birth to America, Alexis de Tocqueville said. A Tory said to his friends in England, I fix all the blame of these extraordinary proceedings upon the Presbyterians. And as one, as a member of the House of Commons said, Horace Walpole, there's no good crying about the matter. Cousin America has run off with the Presbyterian parson, John Witherspoon. When Cornwallis was driven back to ultimate surrender and retreat at Yorktown, all but one of the colonels of the colonial army were Presbyterian elders. It's estimated that more than half of all soldiers and officers of the American Army during the American Revolution were Presbyterians. The references to the role that the clergy played in the American Revolution are many. They didn't just say to their flock, to the men of their churches, get out there, boys, and win the battle. They took up their own arms and went to war. They saw no separation in their role as pastors from their role as warriors fighting for liberty in America. And as one pastor, George B. Spalding, preached in 1876 on the anniversary of independence, the principles of our civil liberty and national independence, which 40 million people in these days are celebrating, had their birth in the election sermons and the fast and Thanksgiving discourses of the Congregational ministers of New England. He said, before Hancock, Franklin, or Jefferson had denounced British tyranny or contemplated resistance to arbitrary power, before they'd even dreamed of independence and of a union of the colonies in great nationality, New England's congregational ministers had been laying bare the falsity of royal assumptions, expounding the principles of good government and of manhood in the state, and educating legislators, judges, and people to an understanding of those civil rights which are the offspring of religious freedom. Another famous historian wrote, the true alliance between politics and religion is the lesson evident in this volume of sermons and apparent in its title, The Pulpit of the Revolution. The pulpit of that era had a name, the Pulpit of the American Revolution. It is the voice of the fathers of the Republic, back to the founding fathers. Enforced by their examples, these pastors did not divorce politics and religion, but they denounced the separation as ungodly. John Wingate Thornton. The pulpit was the secret of that moral energy which sustained the Republic in its material weakness against superior numbers and discipline and all the power of England. To these sermons, the state affixed its imprimatur, or seal of approval. And I could go on. There's so many examples of the role that pastors played, not just in the war for independence, but what the clergy of that era had done is they forged the worldview, the political worldview, in their sermons that fashioned the freest, most prosperous, most beneficent, most prolific missionary sending nation or republic in human history. That's what the clergy did, and that is not an exaggeration. I would dare say if, get back one here. I would dare say if at the end of the revolution someone had said, we need to talk a little bit about separation of church and state, there would have been another revolution. I'm serious. I think it would have started another war. Because every American, to a man, Americans understood the role that clergy played in making this country. So why is this important? So what? As one pastor used to say. So what? To pastors, I would ask, are you dangerous to tyranny? Does your preaching threaten tyranny? Or has your preaching threatened tyranny? I'm not talking about becoming violent or taking up arms against your country. I'm simply saying, are you preaching an understanding of liberty that threatens tyranny? You know, if you have a biblical worldview, and you read the book of Genesis, chapter 3, you hear about the serpent, the father of all tyrants. He employed deceit to arrogate to himself Adam's seat and authority. Adam, through disobedience, and he surrendered his throne to the serpent, making him the prince of the power of the air. What we're doing in America's Black Robe Regiment is we're establishing chapters in every state and political jurisdiction in America where pastors are called to assert their own and the vital leadership and influence of their flocks in civil government. If you have a biblical worldview, you realize when Jesus rose from the dead, there were two kinds of people in the world at that point. Those who are born of God, those who are regenerate, and those who are not. Those who know Jesus are called the children of God. Those who don't know him are called the children of disobedience. And the scripture tells us that the behavior of the children of disobedience is actuated by something called the prince of the power of the air. The children of disobedience, those who know not God, who are not born of God, have no idea how to secure liberty. They haven't got a clue. That's why the people we're watching have taken over our government today are breaking everything. They're experts at destroying things. They have no idea how to establish liberty. In 2012, we had a commissioning of pastors at Patrick Henry College in Northern Virginia. It was kind of a small gathering, but we commissioned a handful of pastors and started what we're doing. We had General Boykin was one of the speakers. E.W. Jackson was another. There's several people. I can't go through all their names. You might know of them. But that's how we got launched. But since that time, we now have chapters in 28 states. And we're calling pastors to do the things that we were calling them to do at that time. Because we believe that the church, it has to be the church that secures liberty. The children of disobedience are not going to get it done. You are not going to secure liberty in this culture and return this government to its rightful owners by reliance on unbelievers. You're just not. So in 2020, we held a commissioning in Virginia Beach. We called it Gideon's 300. We commissioned about 150 more pastors there. And we had this pledge we had them sign called the Gideon's 300 Pledge. The pastors that helped commission these leaders were Jim Garlow. General Flynn is not a pastor, but he helped participate in what we were doing. He was there. Here's what the Gideon's 300 Pledge says, and this is what we're calling pastors to sign across the nation. We've had probably about 700 pastors across the nation sign this pledge. And it begins with several important acknowledgments. It starts with the idea that liberty is sacred. It's the gift of God bestowed by Jesus Christ upon his church, the bride of Christ. And liberty, being sacred, is the church's sacred trust. And the church, as light of the world and salt of the earth, is the sole curator or trustee, steward of the civil society and keeper of the blessings of liberty. And whereas the children of disobedience who walk according to the prince of the power of the air are incapable of understanding, much less securing the blessings of liberty, and temporal governance in the hands of the children of disobedience inevitably devolves into absolute despotism. And whereas my sacred duty to secure the blessings of liberty to my own generation extends to posterity, And whereas the temporal well-being of my flock is as much my concern as their eternal well-being, I will, with the help of God, no longer divorce my role as a shepherd from matters that have a direct bearing on the temporal or eternal welfare of my flock, nor my role as a shepherd from the deliberations and actions of civil government. But I will preach the whole counsel of God, including a minimum of one election sermon prior to every election. I will instill in my flock a biblical worldview by teaching and preaching all of the principles in the Bible. I'll teach my flock that voting in every election for the godliest candidates is a sacred duty incumbent upon everyone professing faith in Jesus Christ. And I will provide ample opportunity for every member of voting age within my flock to register to vote. I will seek to partner with other pastors in my local community to establish and maintain a culture of liberty within the local church and within our local community. So help me God. That's a pretty hefty commitment. I see that it is. It would be a hefty commitment. But when you consider the state of our nation today, the incredible rapid decay of our nation into tyranny right now, it's going to take some sacrifice for us to get there. We're not going to get there without sacrifice. It's imperative that we own up to this as the church. The church has got to do it, folks. Here's how you get in touch with us. The church really founded America. It really did. I mean, you can go back to the Pilgrims, you go back to the Mayflower, you go back to this landing in 1607 at Cape Henry. The church was at the forefront of it. It wouldn't have happened without the church. It couldn't have happened without the church. If that's disappointing to you, I'm sorry. That's the way it is. It just wouldn't have happened otherwise. And that's why it is so important that the church, praise God for this pastor over here, that's why it is so important that the church be front and center in all you are trying to do. I believe that's what I believe, and that's what I've been preaching. So thank you for listening. It's a lot of stuff to take in. Now, just because I know I said some things that were probably a little bit challenging, I'd like to